Hey guys, welcome back to Bungus Custom Bikes. Today we are going to be talking about brake bleeding and the process of bleeding brakes and why we do it. So we just finished doing the handlebar swap on this 03 Gixxer 750, and part of that process included a new brake line going from the this front master cylinder down to the brake calipers. And in doing that, we have a brand new brake line that's full of air, and we've introduced a lot of air to the system. Now, for all you geniuses out there who passed high school physics or whatever class, I didn't, so I don't know. Air compresses, fluid does not, liquids do not. So you don't want any compression in your brakes. So you go to pull that lever, you're going to compress the air rather than move the fluid, and you're not going to stop. That's obviously a problem. So anytime you do any kind of new work on your brakes, you need to bleed them. Maybe not necessarily pads. You don't need to bleed them if you're doing new pads. But anytime you open any of the brake lines, the brake lever, anytime air can be introduced to the system, you need to bleed the brakes. Or if you put new calipers, new brake lines, anything like that on, it needs to be bled. Motorcycles have two different systems. So in most cases, I won't say all motorcycles, in most cases, the rear brake is separate from the front brake. So, if we're doing the front brake, we can leave the rear brake alone because we didn't do anything to it. So the things you need to make sure you have when you go to bleed a brake is obviously brake fluid. This is .4. That's what this motorcycle calls for. .4 is just the type of fluid. They have .1, 2, 3, 4. It might have a 5 and a 6. I can't remember. It's always good to check what your specific motorcycle recommends. It typically says it right here on the reservoir. I know it's far away and hard to see right now, but typically on the reservoir it will say use .4 brake fluid only or use .3 brake fluid only. Sometimes they can be mixed, but typically they can't. And most importantly, when you're bleeding brakes, you always want to start with a new, fresh, unopened bottle of brake fluid. As you can see, this one's still sealed. The reason why, brake fluid is very hygroscopic, so it draws in water. So if you have this open, it'll draw in water, and you don't want water in your brake fluid. It'll just lead to squishy feeling brakes. Water gets into the system, and it's just not good. So always, always, always use a brand new bottle of brake fluid. They sell them in much smaller bottles, which I should have got because I'm definitely not going to use this whole thing. But it's never good to save brake fluid. And lastly, for tools, we're gonna need a couple of sorted wrenches. But this here is a brake bleeding vacuum pump. It can be used for bleeding brakes, checking vacuum systems on engines. Did I say bleeding pumps? Bleeding brakes. Basically, it just draws a vacuum as you pump it. And what that's going to do is, as we draw a vacuum, it will pull the air out of the system and also pull some brake fluid with it that will go into this reservoir. The reservoir is just there to keep the fluid from running back into the pump. But let's get down to the brakes, and I'll show you how we're going to run this system. Alright, so this is going to be a relatively easy process. We're basically just going to bleed the air out of this line after we cracked it and put the new brake line on. This motorcycle has two brake calipers on it. You can see the rotor here, and then there's a rotor on the other side. You can't see the other rotor. Right now I'm on the left-hand side of the bike. And the way it works basically is you can see the brake line here. So these brake calipers are connected and run up to one brake line at the lever and the reservoir. So there's a single brake line here, but on the other side, and you'll see that when we get over there, there's two brake lines. One is coming from the reservoir to the caliper. It basically pushes the fluid through that caliper and then pushes the fluid through this caliper to close both calipers at the same time. Whenever you bleed brakes, you always want to start on the side that is the furthest away from the master cylinder. So we'll bleed this, then we'll go over to the other side, bleed that one, and then we'll squeeze the lever a few times, and that should get the air out of that and just run that air up into the reservoir. While you're doing this, it's always good to make sure that the reservoir is topped off up top, and to check it periodically throughout the process. You never want to run that dry because then you're going to end up pulling air through your system and you've ruined your whole process. Alright, so as you can see, we got the cap off the reservoir here. And that's about the fluid level that's in it. It looks high, but that's just because it's at an angle. So we're gonna go ahead and take some of our fluid and just make sure we're topped off. I like to keep a rag handy because this stuff is extremely corrosive to paint. So I like to make sure that if I spill any on any of the paint, I'm able to get it off pretty quickly. All right, so for the actual process of bleeding, there's one key component that we need for this system. Well, first of all, we want to make sure this is tight. And then we're looking for the bleeder screw. It's really hard to see just because of the light. Let's see if I can't get it a little closer in there. That guy right there. That is the bleeder screw. So it screws into the caliper and it's kind of got a little hole at the top. And that little hole at the top is where we're going to actually connect our vacuum pump to and pull the air through that. So it's an 8mm to open it. We're going to put our 8mm wrench on it, and we don't open it until we have vacuum pulled. So we'll get our vacuum pump on there. And you want to find the end piece that kind of fits it nicely and snug, so that you kind of have to push it on. Because anywhere we leak air in this vacuum system is also somewhere we could leak air back into the brake system. Oh, she's stiff. All right, so we got that on. Now all we're gonna do is we're going to pump our vacuum. I like to get to about 20mm of mercury, and then we'll open that bleeder valve. And what we'll see is we'll see a bunch of fluid run through, mixed with a lot of bubbles. And that's what we want, is those bubbles to come out. All right, so we're gonna get it pumped up. So like I said, about 20mm of mercury. Once we're there, we're gonna get our little 8mm wrench in here and just crack this bleeder valve open. It doesn't need to be open far or wide, just enough till you start seeing some fluid run through this tube. And the fluid running through the tube should also have some air bubbles in it. And there you go. So once your gauge, you don't ever want to lose your full vacuum on this. So watch your gauge as those bubbles are coming out. You see all those pretty bubbles? That's all the air that's in this system. So we want to make sure we watch our gauge, not let it get to zero. If it gets to zero, we've lost our vacuum, and then we run the risk of introducing air back into the system. So we can even open this up a little more if we want to, but I like to run it nice and slow. So as we're getting down to 10, we're going to go ahead and close it. All right, so we get it closed, and then we'll make sure our fitting's still on, and we'll run it again. So also you can see how dirty that fluid is. All right, so we've done it, cycled it a few times, you know, pumping it up to pressure, or I guess vacuum, not pressure, and then bleeding it. And we've gotten to a point where now we're just kind of getting just good fluid coming through. There's not a lot of air coming through anymore, but before we pull it, we always need to make sure we're topping off our reservoir. So let me top that off again. And I'll show you what this looks like now that we're about done with this side. Get my big head out of the way. So if you watch the hose, I'll move my hand once I get it going. You see it's just kind of flowing now. Not really any bubbles anymore. It's coming in waves, but there's no, bubbling or kind of fizzing or anything like that. So that tells us that we are about done with this side. So what we'll do now is we'll move to the other side of the bike and bleed the other caliper. Now let's talk disposal. We got all this nasty old fluid in this reservoir. I keep an old bottle of brake fluid and I just dump it in there. Don't ever dump this down the drain, out in the street, anything like that. It's extremely biohazardous. Excuse me, not biohazardous, but it's not good for the environment. It's not good for animals. It's not good to be in the water. So don't ever just dump this. If you have a oil collection program, you can dump it in there. But just don't dump it outside. Don't dump it down the drain. All right, same process on this side. This is like what I was saying. You see there's two brake lines here. There's this bottom one that's going up to the reservoir, and then the one on top that goes to the other caliper. So, and then same thing, there's your bleeder screw. It's got the little rubber cap on it. We're just gonna do the same thing. All right, we'll give it one more, and we should be good to go. Build our pressure back up. And crack our bleeder. And as you can tell, it's not really coming out with a lot of air anymore. And that's exactly what we want. We're getting more of just a steady stream of fluid rather than all the big bubbles. And we're still getting a few bubbles there, so we'll keep going with it. We don't want any of those air bubbles in there. All right, so that is the process of bleeding brakes. It's pretty simple, pretty straight cut forward. The whole method you're trying to do is just get all the air out of the lines and replace it with good fluid. Once you're done, just check the reservoir at the top. Make sure it's full to, the specifications. It should say lower and upper on it. It says that for a reason. Upper, if you fill it past that, it'll overflow. Lower, you're at risk of running it dry. Get everything tightened back down again, cleaned off real good, because like I said, brake fluid's really corrosive. and then give your lever a couple good squeezes. Make sure it doesn't feel spongy. Make sure it's not coming all the way back to the bars. Maybe take it out for a couple low speed test rides. I emphasize on low speed. That way, if you need to, you can rely on your rear brake to stop you if your front brakes are not done correctly. And speaking of that, just as a disclaimer, this video is for educational purposes only. You know, I'm by no means a trained motorcycle technician. If you go out and do your brakes wrong, don't come sue me because I don't have any money to give you. But that being said, it's the same process for the rear brake. I'm not going to show the rear brake today. When I do the rear brakes on the Goldwing, I'll probably take a video of that. But yeah, that's pretty much it. So thanks for watching. Keep riding.